Gwe madawlok diok and weldasi betgimi udet, and I'm very happy to have been invited to this conference, and I greet you all in my Mi'kmaq language. Today I have a short period of time between, I'm sort of your block between your lunch, so I want to kind of stay somewhat on task. Although before I start, I just want to say I really appreciate the wonderful lecture that Ivana gave. You know, but as a full professor sitting there listening to this, it gave me a kind of a bite in my stomach. A bite in my stomach because I was thinking about all the young Indigenous scholars, young scholars who are here. How many are you as young scholars, new scholars, or come here with a thought of how do I move forward in doing what I have to do, and then you hear this and you get the sense that there's so much that is up against you, and that you need to, pick it up, or all kinds of other things. So it was really a kind of a feeling like, I want to say to you that where I'm at, I don't think that I'm feeling that kind of intensity. I think that we all feel intensities at different times in our careers, but we haven't, in my department anyway, in NRMI College, have come to that extent. And I'm hoping that the example that is coming from the States is not the example that we in my college and in my university hope to move toward, because I think that if that is it, I would say to you all, join your faculty association immediately and resist it from within, and then be able to force something out of that from being an activist against that kind of metricizing our lives. What I really wanted to do today is to try to think about the whole indigenization project. And the indigenizing project, I'd like to begin, first of all, by recognizing as we are on Treaty 4 and 6 territories. And I give you this little map to show you what our treaty territories across Canada are for those who are newcomers to Canada, but to illustrate that Canada is an Indigenous territory. And that Indigenous territory has been divided up in all kinds of treaty areas, with the BC being the latter one that is not a treaty land, but it has been a constitutionalized land of the Indigenous peoples. So I might have that wrong, Saigesh can correct me on that later. But my territory, where I come from, is over here in the blue area, in the far right. And that blue area is where I come from, the Maritimes. And I'm Mi'kmaq from the east coast of Nova Scotia. I was born in the United States and lived in a territory that was my people's land, which was later then developed as federal lands and as federal territory. And now I am a treaty First Nations in Canada, but also I am a recognized federal Indian in the United States because of that, the years that my family lived in the United States in Houlton, Maine. I wanted to talk, these are sort of an overview of where I'm go with this. And first of all is to talk about some of the institutional initiatives that are bringing about indigenization into the academy. And this is sort of kind of a more recent kind of development, but I want to talk about it and problematize a bit of what is emerging as very innovative kind of thing. I also want to talk about it in terms of the market strategy initiative that is coming with that indigenization strategy, and also to address both constitutional rights to Indigenous education and issues around cognitive justice and self-determination that are the effects of cognitive imperialism. For those of you who are coming from other places, Canada is a huge country, and it embodies a wealth of people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of Canada, as well as a wealth number of settlers that have come subsequent with the treaties enacted. At present, we have somewhere between 52 to 73 different languages, over 600 First Nation reserve communities having very small populations, under 100 to over 5,000. And they are in and around urban and rural areas, so that it is all over the vastness of this Canada. And we come in with that within a diverse, what I call landscapes. That language is the First Nation communities and Métis and Inuit communities have languages, so those languages spread over different territories, so it creates a landscape, an awareness of land and ecologies that go within it. And that vast geography is all over Canada in the rural, urban, north, south, sea communities, prairies, boreal forests, and the tundra. And that our communities are also legislated very differently. So the governance structures that some of them still have the traditional structures of governance by their First Nation communities, governance, as in my community, which has the Mi'kmaq, Mi'kmaq Grand Council, Sante Maui-Omi, but also we have other kinds of legislations that are governing the services that are given to Indigenous people, and those are by federal, provincial, and territorial. So what is happening in Canada is that, with this burgeoning of Aboriginal people, there's a leading discourse around this Aboriginal demographic. And everywhere we go, the demographic is raised as an important issue because not just that right now we are 4% of the population, but that our population is very young. And so 6 out of the 10 Indigenous people are under the age of 29. And as a result, we have a huge burgeoning population in our communities of very young people. And by 2017, it is proposed that Aboriginal people from 20 to 29 years old may comprise 30% of the total population in Saskatchewan, 24% in Manitoba, 40% in the Yukon, and 58% in the Northwest Territories. So when we look at those kinds of numbers, we begin to realize just how important this young people population is and why institutions, higher learning, should embrace Indigenous people. And that's been the discourse that has gone with it. When we look at this diversity of people, we find the similarities as well. And the similarities that go with this is, on one side, if we look at the oppressive natures of their living within a colonial experience, has been totally around what Iris Young has thought as these 5 faces of oppression, but also much more in terms of cultural imperialism, racism, exploitation, parallelism, violence, and so on. On the other side of the coin is that Indigenous peoples, despite this great diversity among them, also share very much commonalities across the various places they come from, regardless of whether they come from the tundra or whether they come from even Bolivia or even from Florida, that we find that Indigenous peoples, where they come from, are connected to their land, connected to place, connected to the ecologies of that place. They have a knowledge base and languages that are contributed to those particular territories. And within them, they have a worldview that is very much grounded to a spiritual core. And in that spiritual core, it is communally activated within a relationship with people, as well as relationship with their ancestors, relationships with their land, and all the other kinds of what are thought of as non-human kind of entities that they are continuing to have this connection with, and is part of their indigenous languages. We also find that given the kind of colonial experience that Indigenous people have had, we also are dealing a lot with the kind of the resilience that are representative of the people who are today living out colonial history, but also trying to strive to find a way to make a living today within these economies, as well as in their own knowledge base and own indigenous knowledge. When one of the important kinds of things, when we looked at that particular area of treaty making, is we look at the treaty making that took place, and that one of the quotes that I've taken out is an Ojibwe chief who says, "Our hands are poor, but our heads are rich." And it is richness that we ask so that we may be able to support our families as long as the sun rises and the water runs. And maybe that in the society today where we question, will our water run? How long will our water run? But nonetheless, we still have our sun rising and still setting, we hope. Among those kinds of things that as we look at the treaty area, we find that these imperial treaties have been broken in Canada, and that our First Nations people across Canada have been taking these particular issues to the courts, and in many instances have been winning at the court level. Treaty 4 was signed in 1874, and Her Majesty agreed to maintain a school in the reserves allotted to each band as soon as they settled on the reserve and are prepared for a teacher. I got a little typo there. In Treaty 6, Her Majesty agrees to maintain schools for instruction in such reserves, hereby made as to her government of the Dominion of Canada may seem advisable whenever the Indians of the reserve shall desire it. So it was not that we should have it, it should be imposed on us. It was something we asked for and was something that we were trying to aim to have it embracing what we wanted when we wanted it in a way that was going to support our own livelihoods. Good, I'm glad you turned that down, Tad. Thank you. In the recent report that was done by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, just put out in the last month on the Indian residential schools, as Murray Sinclair noted, that we are really dealing with cultural genocide. Mind you, that cultural genocide doesn't deal with the murderous acts that were committed on many, many children that went to those schools. So it's not just culture, it is a genocide of the people as well. But residential schools was considered and constituted an assault on Aboriginal children, on their families, on their culture, on self-governing and self-sustaining Aboriginal nations. And the impact of that residential school have been immediate and have been ongoing since those earliest days of the schools. And Canadians have been denied a full and proper education as to the nature of those Aboriginal societies and the history of that relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. And this is what, if we look at these issues, we're looking at the ways in which we now need to build upon the Aboriginal and treaty rights to education and bring that knowledge, not only of our own people to who and what they were and are and can be for the future, but also to have others, all non-Indigenous, both faculty and students in our institutions, to understand what that was and the impact it's had on our people. So we're really, I'm pressing to talk about that as a background to some of the initiatives that are undertaken. One of the things that I always talk about is that we have been, all of us, in all instances, my parents and their parents too, have been marinated in Eurocentrism. And Eurocentrism to me is the macro project under which neoliberalism lives. So it's not just neoliberalism is the issue, it's a macro issue, and the macro issue is Eurocentrism. And when we begin to, people begin to divvy up the pie of neoliberalism against something else, this is where, it falters. We must understand what that Eurocentrism is about and how we are marinated in it and how we must resist it. It was James Blout's work as a geographer in 1993, wonderful book, that talked about Eurocentrism, and from that I have had a sense of this is really the broader scope of things that I think needs to be addressed. And what it is that there is a European center that is characterized as superior. There's progress, there's those who have it and those who don't, and a monopoly around all of these knowledge systems that we're talking about are really monopolized by that kind of Eurocentric core of thinking about a superior place, whether it is consumerism or capitalism or neoliberalism or whatever. It doesn't matter. We're still thinking and moving around and holding on to this notion of this core of superiority versus something else. And that is what I'm contesting and resisting. So Eurocentrism is characterized as a singularity in notions of universal and diffused in the periphery, which is why neoliberalism then begins to get notioned out as this is a universal thing. Whatever happens in the States, Canada will do, and whatever Canada does, then some other Commonwealth country somewhere and other places will take up. So it becomes a big wave, a tsunami, if you will, of an idea that gets passed around for which we need to resist and think about what is it that we're learning from within that particular mind frame. So Eurocentrism also gets held as a dominant theory, just like neoliberalism is holding on to this dominant theory thinking, but it is really just a piece of that particular pie. And it's legitimized not only in the capitalist world, the corporate world, and so on, but it's also legitimized in the knowledge production. And knowledge production, whether it's science or education or public institutions, publications, print, the promotion, tenure, all of those kinds of things are then thus promoted within that particular framework. So when we look at that kind of thing, I've always talked about it as represents cognitive imperialism. It is an imperialist idea that is perpetuated and diffused, and it's so built upon very, very damaging assumptions. And the assumptions are around who gets to decide power, influence, control in any kind of structure, and what then is then left out and never brought back into the core. It relies on a colonial dominance, patriarchy, racism, classism, homophobia, gender, all of those things are implicated in that particular kind of structure. It's reflected in the privileging of certain kinds of languages, whether it's French in Canada or English. It's a perpetuation, the idea that only the colonial languages have the place where this knowledge resides. And then it is also then perpetuated in all kinds of protocols and practices and various kinds of ways in which we set a classroom up, or the ways in which we set up a conference, or those kinds. Everything is built around these particular kinds of origins of how do you do things, and thus that gets privileged. And when you then see something else, you say that doesn't represent knowledge, doesn't represent, the way we do things, as opposed to sitting around a circle or, passing a stick, or any of number of other kinds of ways we do things. And in so doing, it creates the othering, the difference, and inflicts on Indigenous peoples the soul wound. Some of the other contemporary manifestations of cognitive imperialism for Indigenous people is that it defines success as assimilation. and assimilation to the dominant Eurocentric values, norms, and languages. It also is a place for which there is no conventional place where, or a formal place where First Nations languages, knowledge have a way to be allowed to thrive. Similarly, First Nations educators in all of our institutions are either projected as the experts. In other words, we want you on all of our committees, we want you on all of our advisories, we want you on all these things, and or they're projected as deficient. You know, so you aren't there yet, you're not, you know, you haven't got, you know, whatever it is. So when we look at the schools, for example, a lot of our First Nation teachers, you know, are in schools, but they are always being, you know, thrust to do everything that's Indigenous, and then they also have to do their own work. And yet, on the other hand, when they're thought about and they are asked where you got your education, if you came from ITEP or SUNTEP or NORTEP, then you're projected as you didn't get the conventional educational core, and thus you haven't, you know, you don't meet the standard. So when I look to what kinds of things are improving, or some of the ways in which in Canada a discourse of Aboriginal and treaty rights has been risen since the 1982 when the Constitution of Canada affirmed Aboriginal and treaty rights. And since that time, the first ministers have been trying to figure out, first of all, what is Aboriginal rights, because they don't understand it, because it's not written down, like in a treaty where it says, you know, I take this land, or I take this, you know, I'm going to the level of the plow, and so on. That our discourses in the treaty, it is not in the Aboriginal rights section. So Aboriginal rights are indeed something that is affirmed and belongs to Indigenous people and belongs to them in the traditional structures of their own being. And those are everything that, when we look at things in terms of their governance of themselves, their governance in their communities, their socialization in their families, teachings in their family, Indigenous knowledge, their connections to their elders, and many, many other kinds of things. But the first ministers met and they talked about that, and they wrote, Aboriginal and treaty rights played a determining role in improving the quality of life of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Their distinct social, cultural, historical, and legal traditions are a defining feature of Canada and form an important context for cooperative efforts to improve their well-being. So this sort of set a context for something very important that began to emerge. And I turn to and look at some of the kinds of initiatives that have gone on. For example, the Canadian Council of Ministers of Education in 2010 put forward this particular thing called Learn Canada, 2010 Learn Canada. And in these particular elements of strengthening Aboriginal language and culture, enhancing equity and funding, increasing access, retention, graduation, sharing responsibility and accountability, noting those are the kind of, you know, we need to share data on everybody to find out who's got, you know, and so on. And this planning for transition, seamless, going from First Nations schools to public schools to universities and so on, are all the kinds of things that have been brought forward, which are, I have to say that having worked with people who've been part of the Canadian Council of Ministers of Education, this has been an aspiration, but not yet a full realization, because they haven't got an idea about how to achieve this, the method for doing this, the outcomes for doing this, what is it they're going to be setting as indicators for these. In the same year, 2010, another wonderful thing happened, and that was something that was going on with some conversations between the deans of education in Canada, and with that came up with the Association of Canadian Deans of Education came up with this Accord on Indigenous Education. The thing that I think that is significant in this particular accord is not so much the typical stuff that goes in here, is the respectful, welcoming environments, the respecting, inclusive curricula, but also the element of challenging existing frameworks. That to me is a wonderfully significant and important element to this particular structure, as well as the elements of developing responsive pedagogies. But the last point is valuing indigeneity. And indigenous knowledge is indeed one of the elements that has been brought into the Accord. I credit people like Lorna Williams and also Joanne Archibald, who were co-producers of this particular thing at the time that John Lundy, Frank Blythe, and Cecilia Reynolds are among those who were the key crafters of this particular thing. I also bring to your attention in 2015 another initiative that was brought forward, and that is from the Colleges and Institutes of Canada. And in the Colleges and Institutes of Canada, they have put forward also this protocol. And in the protocol is that each of these institutions commit to making Indigenous education a priority. They will ensure governance structures recognize and respect Indigenous peoples. It will implement intellectual and cultural traditions of Indigenous people through curriculum and learning approaches relevant to learners and communities. It will support students and employees to increase understandings and reciprocity among Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. It will commit to increasing the number of Indigenous employees with ongoing appointments throughout the institution, including Indigenous senior administrators. And it will establish Indigenous-centered holistic services and learning environments for learning success, and finally build relationships and be accountable to Indigenous communities. Now, in all of these particular agreements, there are several kinds of important things, and I'm delighted to say I accept that these are good foundational blocks, but they miss some places. So I will tell you that in a minute. But let me just turn to the last one, and that's Universities Canada, which is all the presidents in the universities have come together, and in 2015, just last month, came up with this 13-point plan, which they're going to implement across all universities across Canada. You can find all of this online, by the way, if I haven't, you can just go to the Universities Canada website and they will provide you that, as well as with the institutes and colleges. In this, I think there's two important things that I'd like to just point out, is that there is a place in the third bullet down that recognizes the importance of indigenization of curricula through responsive academic programming, support program orientations, and pedagogies. And then if you move over to the other red area that I've noted, is that recognizing the importance of providing greater exposure and knowledge for non-Indigenous students on realities, histories, cultures, and beliefs of Indigenous people in Canada. So I see that as kind of the unpacking of the, when we look at a decolonizing perspective, we need to unpack the assumptions and colonial notions that people have had about Indigenous people, and that's where that comes in for all of Canadians. But at the same time, the other is to indigenizing of the curricula through certain kinds of strategies called programming, support programs, orientations, and pedagogies. Okay, when you go through these points, I would say that, places like Regina, places like University of Saskatchewan could say, yeah, we're doing that. We're doing that, tick, 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 tick. We're doing a good thing, and yes, we just need more of the same. And I would like to suggest that a lot of this is also built within a Eurocentric foundation, and that Eurocentric foundation is built around culturalism, or indigenous as a cultural frame for addressing both the problem, or culturalism is used as both the analysis and the solution. So we're examining issues of Indigenous programming around looking at Indigenous, what is this cultural issue that we're going to bring forward. So anybody can thus bring this forward. You know, if you have a bit of faculty that have some bit of background in Native history or Native studies or so on, where does that bring in our own indigenous people, our own elders, our own experts in these fields? Well, and it also sort of keeps it within a Eurocentric framework for also the solutions that are selected for that. And it ignores the hidden norms of neoliberal capitalism or Eurocentrism at large. In so doing, it pathologizes First Nation students. In other words, it's saying that it's a capacity issue. We need to bring more Indigenous people into our schools, and it's a capacity issue. All we have to do is help them come in, give them the necessary skills, language, tutoring, you know, motivational skill building, and a whole number of things. In other words, we're really doing another assimilation regimen by virtue of all of this kind of programming that brings the people in and spits them out as workers in the marketplace. In other words, we need more people in the mines. We need more people in the indigenous or in our universities. So we get them through and we hire them. So basically, a lot of indigenization is about bringing indigenous faculty who will do all the stuff that, you know, you're talking about here. But what do they know about indigenization? Or what do they know about indigenous? Or where do they live? How do they live? What community are they connected to? What kinds of languages do they bring in? And how will they animate that scholarship in that language if you have to have this, you know, this tier 1 journals that you're having to produce in? So basically, you really are looking for an assimilationist paradigm for Indigenous scholars to come out from in order to come into this institution in order to be able to produce this kind of thing that Yvonne was talking about. So the other kind of thing is that it totally ignores the problems that are created by privileging, by whiteness, by dominance, by normalization of the status quo, by the complicities that are put with privilege and discrimination. So you bring in Indigenous faculty and you then say, yes, we did what we were intending to do, we did what we were supposed to do, but no, because you really have just, you know, perpetuated and infused a more acculturation and assimilation into the whole paradigm that is then the kind of thing that Indigenous scholars have to move through. And it ignores, if any, among a few things, but ignores the poverty of Indigenous communities. It ignores their oppression. It ignores class hierarchy. It ignores wealth distribution in Canada, especially the under-resourcing of First Nation schools. So what I see happening is that you can say, we're going to bring people into the university. We're going to get them through. We're going to get more Aboriginal faculty in there, more senior administrators, but the context they come from, the situations of poverty, the situations of oppression they come from, that's not something we're going to worry about, because basically we're going to let those young people who graduate go out there and deal with that. They're going to be the answer to the problem, not we are going to address it in any which way. So the thinking is that, you know, the institutional plans that we have maintain the Eurocentric foundations as a main core of education. It ignores the large issues facing Aboriginal peoples in Canada, their self-determination, their Indigenous knowledge reconstruction, their restoration, reconstruction, and their community building for a market strategy. So people are then brought in simply to be feeding the market, but do nothing about what's happening except to say, if you make money, you probably will share it with your family, and that's wealth distribution. So it does not also reconcile with the damage that it was done in the past. All of the damage that was done by the residential schools, all the damage that was done by the Royal Commission report on Aboriginal people that came out nearly 20 years ago. This coming year will be the 20th year for that. none of those things are being addressed by higher education in so doing indigenization. So the focus, again, is on individual capacity and growth and not on the collective needs of nations, communities, or resource sharing. And it assumes that First Nation people, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, that their goals are what the institution thinks those goals should be. You know, it assumes that somehow we all just need more capacity out there. We just need more building blocks of great things, and somehow that's going to change things. It won't unless we put some effort to it. Maybe those last points that Ivana talked about might be then thought about as we think about this. And finally, I think it's important that we look at the reconciliation of Aboriginal and treaty rights, which are part of the Constitution of Canada of 1982, part of 1867 as well. And that restoration is in terms of the fact that we have that affirmed in the Constitution. It should be reconciled with all the provincial and territorial legislation and policies that are put forth by all these institutions. In other words, we have an imperative. We have a constitutional imperative, but it is not being addressed by no one because they haven't reconciled with what this says. And the Supreme Court of Canada always has to be pressed to, you know, to tell provinces and territories to implement, but the Supreme Court in R.V. Cote in 1996 said that every substantive Aboriginal and treaty right has been embedded as an incidental constitutional right to teach that right. So if you got Indigenous knowledge and they say, yeah, you have it as an Aboriginal right, well, you have a right to teach it. And all institutions that have been taking it away from us have a duty and a responsibility by virtue of this, the constitutional right to affirmation of Aboriginal treaty rights. They have a responsibility, duty to affirm that as well. And that is why it needs to be put into there. So Aboriginal education created the constitutional land fiduciary obligations. That's the government giving and doing and overseeing its obligations that it took on within the treaties and passes them on through to the provincial governments to respect Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous in Aboriginal education. So it also is about making sure that treaty education is also part of the schooling based upon what parents want and not on the desires of any neoliberal agenda. And it also is affirmed in other kinds of things like rights issues, like human rights, as well as in the rights of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. I see that I've got just a couple of more minutes to close on this, but I would just like to say that one of the things that we are doing in Saskatchewan that I think is an important imperative that is taking a sweep across Canada is growing, and that is that in Saskatchewan we have the minister has instructed a mandated treaty instruction and treaty education. And that treaty is in treaty relationships, the spirit of intent of the treaties, and the historical context of treaties and treaty promises. Unfortunately, in this thing, great, they're doing that, but they haven't addressed the Aboriginal rights as well. So you've got treaty responsibilities, but not Aboriginal rights responsibilities, and those are embedded in terms of Indigenous knowledges and the living and being and surviving and sharing their total Indigenous culture within their communities and passing those on. So even though we have this as a very important thing that has been brought forward, it has some limitations. And I would just say that I'm pleased that we have at least a mandate, and we've gotten through K-12 on treaty education instruction, and now that is beginning to move into other places. In fact, this last month, Nova Scotia is moving toward doing similar kinds of things that is being done here in Saskatchewan and what has been done in also in Manitoba. I'm not sure if they do it in Alberta. Do they do it in Alberta? No. Okay. So this is sort of like a very new, and part of that comes about because of the work that's been done with First Nation communities, with the First Nation chiefs, with the First Nations elders that are here. So I close on this to say that if we were to move to a higher education, and I would say one of the questions we need to ask is what is higher about higher education, that we need to look at it as systemic transformations. In other words, we need some parallel systems, but Indigenous knowledge should be as equally strong as that which is knowledge systems that have been cultivated through the research mechanisms and tier 1 journals and whatever all that you're taking up as building blocks for your education. But ours will be different, but it should be at least parallel and similar in terms of its strength. And with that, I would like to say thank you very much for giving me this opportunity today to have some time with you.
We do have time for a couple of comments or questions, and the mics are on. Thank you, Marie.
Marie, thanks very much. I'm Sarah Abbott. I teach here at the University of Regina. And I really appreciated what you were getting at in terms of the foundation of the Eurocentric everything. And I'm working on a paper right now. I used the Aboriginal People Survey, and I looked at socioeconomic factors in relation to traditional activities and engagement, propensity of, and totally you could see that as education goes up and as employment income goes up, engagement in traditional activities goes down. Thank you.
Thank you. And at the corollary to that is wherever there has been a connection and engagement with Indigenous languages and Indigenous cultures and so on, success goes up.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Julie Vaudrechard from ROU. And I wanted to address that last sentence that you said. How do we address the language question in a broader sense? How do we address heritage Indigenous language revitalization within a broader educational framework?
Thank you. I think that, first of all, recognizing the colonial languages of French have not fared in the same manner as the English language, and nor has all of their development in the same way as with Indigenous peoples as well. And so we see a colonial experience that occurs even with the colonial group of the French. But I think that in all those locations, as I mentioned at the very beginning, where people were across all of these nations, that I think that it is that where language is situated in place around a particular territory, this is where we need to be building those blocks. It's not about having 73 languages in a school. It's about how do we connect our students to the colonial, but also to their Indigenous histories that belong from within their locale. And I always have felt that, Indigenous education is such an easy approach, because you can really start off by saying, wherever we are located, this is the territory on which we build our whole structure, recognizing those peoples, those lands, and all those kinds of things within, as well as bringing then in those other peoples who came in history and over time. So it's not, for me, I think that to me it's an easy process, but I understand its difficulties. But part of the difficulty comes because of its diminishment for so long. Yay, I get a Len question. Don't make it hard, Len.
Thank you very much, Marie. As you know, we have a new president at the University of Saskatchewan, and when the announcement was made, he defined the university as characterized by 4 activities: to inquire, to inform, to innovate, and to indigenize. Of that four, only the fourth one has been deemed problematic and has triggered racist spasms in the local press, quiet, private put-downs within the university. That indigenization is a form of damaging accommodation that is an affront to academic excellence. Would you reflect on the negative deficiency narratives that surround indigenization every time one speaks that term?
Thank you, Len. That's so good. A year ago, we also had a similar kind of thing when our new administration said they were going to hire more Indigenous people as one of their 7 top things they were going to do. And when they did, the question I asked was, how are you going to deal with the racialization and also what do you call it? The pushback when you just, fired 250 people within the institution through Transform Us. So in similar instances like this, where indigenization is seen as a way of reducing if I might use that now, the neoliberal kind of approach to making things better and progress, we're going to take indigenization, which is viewed as the negative side of it all, and thus why would we want to go back? As opposed to dealing with how do we move forward as a group of people, how do we engage everyone who is from here on in must be seen as complicit in the future of Indigenous people, even if you are unwilling to accept that what you have been complicit in the past with, if you're unwilling to take that. Everyone today now must be complicit with, as the Treaty Commissioner has noted, we must be complicit in terms of affecting a future with Indigenous people, and each one of us has a way to achieve that and should be part of that particular agenda.
We have another round of appreciation for our